Welcome to the Hearing Horizons podcast from the Hearing Review. This is Andy Lundin, the Associate Editor for the Hearing Review. I'm happy to be joined by Dr. Laura Pratesi, an audiologist who is the owner of Citrus Hearing Clinic in Clermont, Florida, and is also the president of the Audiology Practice Standards Organization, otherwise known as APSO. Laura received her Bachelor of Science in Communication and Sciences Disorders with a concentration in Human Development from Auburn University in 2008 and her Doctor of Audiology degree from Auburn University in 2012. Today we'll be discussing the APSO's overall mission to establish minimum standards of care in audiology and what these standards mean for hearing care professionals. Welcome, Laura, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. All right, can you first provide a little bit of background about APSO, the organization's mission in defining minimum standards of care for audiologists, and why it's so important to define these minimum standards of care?
Absolutely. So, APSO is a community of audiologists who believe that developing and adopting practice standards is key to the future growth of our profession. Every other doctoring level profession, as well as nurse practitioners and physician assistants, have established and published minimum standards of care. Yet that has never been done for the profession of audiology. If we want to eventually attain limited license practitioner status or be looked at as limited license physicians someday, then we need to be just like all those other medical professions out there and also have minimum standards of care published. Right now, it can vary greatly depending on what state the audiologist is practicing in, but we need some sort of national standard or national guideline to go based on. And while we have best practices that have been published by some of our other national organizations like ASHA or the American Academy of Audiology, we need to have minimum standards published as well. And so in 2017, there was a group of audiologists that kind of got together for a podcast and were discussing different types of standards in the audiology profession and how they apply to everyday practice. And that discussion led to them realizing that we did not currently have universal minimum standards of care. And so that's what really led to the development of APSO. So we're an apolitical organization. We have support among audiologists that are within the other national organizations like ADA and AAA and ASHA. Our goal is to eventually have our standards endorsed by those other national organizations, as well as state audiology associations and state boards. But, where those other bigger organizations work so hard in a variety of different ways, we have one goal, and that's to develop minimum standards. So we don't have anything else on our plate. We can focus on this one job, and it's a big one. It can take about a year for a standard to get published from start to finish. So there's a lot of work to do, and we're ready to roll up our sleeves and get it done.
Awesome. And could you share a little bit about your journey in audiology and what inspired you to become involved with APSO and eventually lead the organization? I know that that's a big draw to the organization. You're interested in other people participating in the organization.
Absolutely. There's so many different ways people can get involved in our organization. You can be a member, which costs about $50 a year in membership dues. You can be a subject matter expert in a topic. So we're currently recruiting subject matter experts for infection control and pediatric diagnostic hearing evaluations. We're also going to be recruiting tinnitus experts. We also then have the board of directors, of which I'm president currently. And these all have varying degrees of commitment. So being a board member is a position that you hold for a year. I was on the board for a year, and then I served as vice president for a year, and now I'm serving as the current president. And next year I'll be sort of the past president. So I'll served for 4 years on the board. But subject matter experts may have a shorter commitment. They might just be working on a standard for several hours a week for a month, and then their kind of job is done. So you don't have to have all the time in the world or all the money in the world. There's just varying levels that you can contribute to the organization. Um, that was a little bit of a tangent, but I was born before the universal newborn hearing screening was implemented nationwide. And so, although we suspect I was born with hearing loss, my own hearing loss was not identified until I was 5 years old. And I failed a preschool screening before going into kindergarten. And so, my mother, who had been concerned, was finally able to get a referral to an ENT to get my ears checked out. And they told her that I had a unilateral hearing loss in my left ear, but they dissuaded my parents from fitting me with hearing aids. They told my parents that as long as I was making A's and B's in school, to not worry about it, that hearing aids would just make things louder and not clearer, really downplayed what technology could do for me. And so I followed up once a year for about 3 years. And then when I was 8, my parents were told, well, it's been stable. So just call us if anything changes. And they let me walk out the door. And I didn't get a hearing test again until I had been accepted to Auburn. I was going there on a theater scholarship. I was
Mm.
originally a musical theater and opera major,
Oh, wow.
but I was a little nervous about being in a classroom or a lecture hall with 300 other students. And so I was applying to the Office of Accessibility, which at the time was called the Students with Disabilities Department. And they said, well, hey, we need a hearing test that's been completed in the last decade. And I didn't have one. So I went back to the ENT and they tested me and they couldn't believe that I had, gone all that time without amplification. And they said, wow, you've really done a lot without a hearing aid. Do you want one? And I had never tried one. I didn't know anything about it. And I said, do I need one? And they said, no, probably not. And they let me walk away again.
Oh, wow.
So I still didn't have a device and was going through my classes and was getting by as best I can. I didn't know any different. And then I got interested in being a music therapist. So I started taking classes in rehab and special ed and speech pathology, and that led to an Audiology 101 class. And I adored it. I made a 100 in the class. My professor was like, you've got to do this, come to the dark side, and so I put in my application and was accepted to Auburn for the doctoral program. And then my classmates fit me with my very first hearing aid, and it changed my life. And I just knew that I had to go into this field and make sure that nobody else fell through the cracks the way I had. And so that to me is really my passion behind minimum standards. I think that we need some of these guardrails in place to really ensure that the people who are most vulnerable and most need help are going to get it. And so that, it also serves as a protection, not only for the patient, but for the practitioner as well. If I have, documented that I'm following not only the minimum standard of care, but best practices, that can just protect me in the job that I'm doing. But also, if patients have really experienced something negative at the hands of someone who doesn't have their best interests at heart, they have some recourse, because that time is so precious and you can't get that back. I think that my hearing loss has made me a better audiologist, but it would have been so much less stressful and so much less energy and effort if I had had those accommodations and the benefit of hearing all along. I would have
Hmm.
struggled a lot less.
Yeah.
And we don't need to, forge greatness through trial and adversity. We can have those supports in place early on and get people the help that they need so much sooner. And so I just want to make sure that nobody falls through the cracks on my watch. And that's really what led me to get involved with audiology as a profession and then APSO as an organization.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I really love how you tie that personal element to where you are at now. I think that's great, and I think it's very fitting that you are in the role that you are now. That's awesome. All right, could you walk us through the process of developing and reviewing a standard at APSO from concept to publication?
So the standards development process is pretty extensive. So what we'll usually do is the APSO board will assign a standard, and that is usually after a professional survey. So we'll ask the membership, what do you think we need a standard on? And we've really been focusing over the last 5 years on really general big standards that apply to the majority of the profession. So, audiologists can work in a variety of different settings. We can work in the VA, in hospitals, and in ENT or medical practice, private practice. There's educational audiologists. There's ones who work in industry or in hearing conservation. And I think that one of the things we've struggled with is that we maybe feel that some of our national organizations represent just a part of the profession. Like, oh, that's the group for educational audiologists, or oh, that's the group for private practice audiologists, or oh, that's the group that's going to pertain to me. And we didn't want to do that. We wanted to be by and for audiologists in all walks of life, no matter what kind of place they practice in. And so we'll survey the profession and see what is a standard that applies to you, what's important to you, what should we work on next. And so the first standards that we have published are pertaining to the widest variety of audiologists. So the first standard that we published 5 years ago was a general audiology intake standard. So basically a case history. What's the minimum amount of information you need to work with a patient? And then our second standard was hearing aid fitting for adult and geriatric patients. And then we also published a hearing aid fitting for pediatric patients, and then a comprehensive diagnostic hearing evaluation for adult patients. And so those are the current standards that are out there, and we sunset the standards every 5 years. So our first standard, the general audiology intake standard, is currently about to be opened back up and reviewed. But in order to get those standards published first, we will select the topic after the membership survey, and we'll recruit subject matter experts. And so when we have enough subject matter experts, and we try to have, I think, between 5 and 6 per group, we will separate them into a development working group and a verification working group. And so the development working group first creates a first draft. They're looking at guidelines that have been published. They're looking at research and data that's available. They're looking to see what is happening in the real world. And once they create that first draft, then it goes to the working group to review it and say, yes, we agree with this. And so that's where we might, if we were to develop a standard on tinnitus, we would have a bunch of tinnitus experts, and we'd have the first group, and then that second group would independently need to agree with the first group on the work that had been done. And once we get that first draft completed, then it will go to a public review and comment period. And so that's when we will put it out there for anybody to give their thoughts, their comments, correct us. We want that feedback. We want to know, is this realistic? We don't want it to just be an ivory tower. What are the people in the trenches seeing, and is that working for them? And once that public review and comment period is over, it goes back to the development working group, and they review the comments, and they'll make the final edits. And it may go through those steps multiple times. But once we make the final edits, then it goes to an ethics panel for review. So we want to make sure that anything that we put out there and publish, that it's going to meet the ethical standards. And so the ethics committee gets a hold of it, and they let us know if anything needs to be tweaked. Once the ethics panel has reviewed it, it then goes to legal review. So we are a 100% volunteer organization, with the exception of we engage a legal team to review the standards that we're putting out there. We want to make sure that they are legal and applicable for all 50 states. So the states can have very different views on things, but we want to make sure that if we publish something, it can be applied to any of the states. And so we do pay for that service. We do feel that that is a necessary part of what we do. And then once it has made it through the legal review, then it goes to the APSO board for final approval, and then it's published online on our website, which is www.audiologystandards.org. And although these standards have been developed by and for American audiologists, they are open and free and accessible for anybody to use for whatever they want. So one of the cool things that I've experienced as president is going to the AAA conference and the AudBoss conference, and I'm meeting audiologists from all over the world. And, while we are working on this here, there are baby audiologists in other countries, other countries that may not have an audiology program, may not even know about hearing science. And so you have people who are working on kind of setting up the framework in their own countries, and they can even take this and use it as a blueprint. Some of the things may not apply because of culture differences or language differences or government setup differences, but it's great to know how other audiologists in the world are working, and we're happy that we're able to host this on a public website for anyone to access and use it as the blueprint for their own practice standards.
Great. That's very, very informative. Yeah, that's awesome. All right. So with the advancements in technology like AI, telehealth, and OTC hearing aids, how is APSO planning to integrate emerging technologies into its standards?
That's a fantastic question. I think that is something that we have really struggled with. I know that here in Florida, we had a statute about our hearing aid bill of sale that was developed, I think, in 1994. And
Oh, wow.
it specified certain prices for ear molds and for services. And, inflation and 30 years have gone by,
Yeah.
and things are very different now than how they were. And so that is one of the things that we have tried to do, is we've tried to future proof the standards by sunsetting them and
Mm,
opening them up for review every 5 years. Because you're right, telehealth was not something that was even kind of on the radar when I was in school, from 2008 to 2012. And so we do need to update things and make sure that they are still on par with what we're seeing in clinical practice, and that it's going the way of the world. And we are going to need to have standards on how we're going to incorporate telehealth and AI to make sure that patients are still receiving the same benefit via telehealth that they would from in-person care. Currently there's not really a way to do real ear measurement remotely. Now, we don't say as an organization that real ear measurement and test box measures are the only ways you can do verification and validation, but we do say that verification and validation are things that must be done as part of a hearing aid standard. We have to take some sort of pre and post fitting measures to ensure that if we're fitting a patient with amplification, that we have done no harm and that they have benefited from the treatment that they're receiving. So if you're being fit through the internet, how is that organization that has fit you making sure that the patient is receiving adequate benefit from the technology, that it was worth the money that you paid? And that needs to be documented in some way, even if the state that you're in isn't legally requiring it. We as a profession need to hold our professionals to some sort of standard to
mhm.
ensure that they're doing right by their patients.
Right. No, that makes sense. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay. And what role do you see APSO playing in the future of audiology, especially as the field continues to evolve? As you mentioned, it's clearly there's a lot of technology coming in and things changing all the time, and some things that were normal 30 years ago are no longer the case now. So, yeah, how do you guys keep up with everything?
Yeah. I think by attending different conferences and having conversations with people, I had a lot of really great conversations at the AAA conference in April with a lot of students. You know, I I have found so many audiologists are surprised by the work we're doing because I think it's just been assumed that it's already been done or it's been around. But audiology is a really young profession, and we kind of pushed for and got the AUD before we had these minimum standards in place. And not that we put the cart before the horse, and I wasn't around back then, but so I can't do anything about the past, but I can do something for the future, and I can build a legacy that is a foundation that we can build, futures on. And I think that if we do want a dream like the Medicare Audiology Access Improvement Act, or MAIA, to move forward, then we need to prove to our Congress people and our senators that we are just like every other doctoring level profession out there. And if those professions have minimum standards of care, then we need to have minimum standards of care in order to be looked at and taken seriously, and to show that our level of education is similar to theirs, and that we are more than just allied health professionals, that we do prescribe devices, we do treat and manage and care for these patients. And so, even though we are an apolitical organization and we don't have a lobbyist and we don't necessarily make statements about legislation, if we as a profession want certain legislative pieces to be passed, then we have to set ourselves up for success. And that is something that I believe that the work we're doing is foundational to that. And it's vitally important, and it's something that we need to focus on and to do. And so I'm really proud that I have had the opportunity to lead the group this year. I they have been so patient with me. It was a steep learning curve to suddenly take on the mantle of
Mm.
being president of a national organization. But, I have gotten to learn at the elbows of some really prominent industry leaders, and have some amazing advisors and mentors along the way. And I've been blessed to have women that have come before me that have mentioned my name in rooms where things are happening, and I could not have gotten where I am today without them. And so I owe them a lot, and I hope that I can do the same.
All right. Well, I want to thank you so much for your insights on this topic, Laura, and I also want to thank you, the listeners, for joining in. For more great content from the Hearing Review, visit us online at hearingreview.com, and while you're there, subscribe to our publications and our newsletters.